Noswaith pawb, good evening everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to be wearing an eye patch in order to give this lecture because I had cataract surgery last week and my two eyes are getting rather confused. But apart from that, I'm very well. So just to bear with me while I put this on. Now, between about 1998 and 2013, I was involved in a major research project to put together a corpus of early medieval inscribed stones and stone sculpture in Wales. And you can see the three publications, all published by University of Wales Press, that came out of this. The first one by Mark Redknapp and John Lewis dealt with South Wales, and then my two volumes dealt with South West Wales and North Wales respectively. And as David has already explained, it was in partnership, this project, with the National Museum and also with the Royal Commission. And many of the photographs that you will see in this talk are those of particularly Ian Wright, the former Royal Commission photographer. The actual project was largely funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. So what I'm going to concentrate on today is the sculpture from the period around 400 to 650 CE, the period immediately after the Romans. We see this in this period, the fall of the Roman Empire. We see by the end of the period, the establishment of early medieval kingdoms, and also during this period, the rise of Christianity. And of course, for the talk, which comes 2 days after St. David's Day, it's in this period, probably in the 6th century, that St. David would have lived. Now, I'm going to try and concentrate on three different areas when we see of the inscribed stones of this period. Firstly, their archaeological contexts. Secondly, connections with both Europe and around the Irish Sea. And lastly, and in slightly more detail, on the kind of identities that we can see that are changing in this period in Wales between around 400 and 650. So just to kind of set the scene, so to speak, we can see here on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see a map of late Roman Wales with some of the sites. We have Roman sites such as forts, which I'll come back to later. We have Roman towns such as Cael. We have the network of Roman roads, but also we have a pattern of rural settlements. Not just, we have some Roman villas, particularly in the southeast, but primarily we have hut groups of different sorts and hill forts. And some of these go on within occupation into the early medieval period, into the post-Roman centuries. By around 650 or earlier, 550, 650, Wales had a pattern of early medieval kingdoms. And we can see some of those on the map here. And I will, for example, be referring specifically to Gwynedd and perhaps Dyfed and Brycheiniog later on in my talk. Now, when we come to think about the inscribed stones that date between the 5th and the mid-7th century in early medieval Wales, we have to see that these are the most prolific form of material evidence. And we have to try and use these to tell us, I suppose, stories or fill in some of the fragments of evidence that we can put together ideas about how Wales was changing in this period. Now, over on the left there, you can see on the map it's a map of all the early medieval inscribed stones that we know about in Wales, both lost ones that were recorded by antiquarians and ones that you can go and still see today. And there are, in fact, around 150, just over 150 early medieval inscribed stones from this period. And I thought you'd like to see the most recent discovery, which was in 2015. A member of the public contacted Gwynedd Archaeological Trust. They'd seen some writing on a stone, and yes, it was an early medieval inscribed stone, as you can see, reused as a gatepost. And what the farmer had done was to clear the ivy from it, and exposing the inscription for the first time in years. And of course, it's in very poor condition, but from this, you can see that the inscription commemorates a woman. It's obviously a gravestone, and it says "Votepa hic jacet," here lies Votepa. It's in Roman letters, or Latin letters, and essentially it's a Latin inscribed stone. And you can see, I think, some of the difficulties of recording this kind of material. I should say that only 3 early medieval inscribed stones have been found since 1971, and I'll show you the 1971 one, and indeed the other more recent one about 2008 later on in the lecture. So we have Roman letter Latin inscribed stones, but contemporary with these are stones that are inscribed in Ogam, and many of these are in fact bilingual, as you can see here at St Dogmaels in Pembrokeshire. And you can see the Ogam and Roman letter inscribed stone here, and we'll come back to the details of this later on, but you can see here the Ogam alphabet. Now, the Ogam alphabet is an alphabet of strokes and notches for the vowels, as you can see here. And this was the first way in which primitive Old Irish was written down in this period. And it was an alphabet that was influenced by Latin, and we think that it began probably, it began in Ireland probably around the 4th century CE. And we can see on the other side of the screen here, we can see areas where there are concentrations of Ogam inscriptions, and these are areas of Irish settlement. And we can return to these a bit later on. Now, dating the inscribed stones is not easy. And the reason for this is that the inscribed stones have to be dated normally by a combination of looking at the Latin or indeed primitive Old Irish formula, or both, on the inscription, by looking at the language of the inscription, because in this period, 3 languages are being spoken in Wales. The most common language, but this is not as common on the inscribed stones, except in the form of names, is not found. Only British names, only names which are British are found, not British words, is what I'm trying to say, on these early inscribed stones. But then we also have Irish was being spoken up to around 600, and Latin survives as a spoken language probably up to about 700, and then continues in as the language of the church. And in fact, there's only one inscribed stone in Welsh, and that's a later inscribed stone from Tywyn, which dates to the early 9th century. Now, the other thing we look at is the lettering, because the lettering changes over time between the 5th century and the early 7th century. But the only inscribed stone that can be dated with precision is that from Llancadwaladr on Anglesey. This is one of the most famous of the lot, and it commemorates King Cadfan of Gwynedd, who died around 625, and it commemorates him in language, very colourful language, Catamanus rex sapientissimus, opinartissimus, omnium regum, Catamanus, wisest and most renowned of all kings. Now you'll note that the lettering of this inscription is a mixture of capitals, some of them quite distorted, such as the A, and small letters. Now, this is what we see by around the early 7th century, this form of writing. But it is evolving during the 5th and 6th centuries from Roman origins. And we see capitals and gradually more and more smaller letters, but the letters are often either turned sideways, or sometimes they're even upside down. And we'll see examples of that as we go along. So this comes right at the end of the series, this one from Llancadwaladr. And before that, we basically have to use comparative means in order to date things. So having said some of the preliminaries, I now want to come to the first of my 3 major things I want to focus on. And that is the archaeological contexts of these inscribed stones. And I think it's important to note that quite a significant number of these inscribed stones are found associated with Roman contexts. And the first thing they're found, the most common of these, is beside Roman roads. And this is the famous Mae'r from Ystrad in Breconshire. And this is situated beside a Roman road, as you can see. The Roman road is fat sort of here, but not this side. But you can see that this was excavated. The stone had fallen over, and it was excavated by the famous archaeologist Cyril Fox, who was the director of the National Museum in, I think, 1939 and published in 1940. And he thought he'd found the original stone hole, which was set in the side of the Roman road. And of course, we should remember that in the Roman period, burials were beside Roman roads, particularly outside towns or forts. And these, I think we should see them as landmarks, which people still using the roads would have seen, of course, as they walked by or went by on horses or whatever. And just to note the lettering here, this is a very typical example with the D back to front, the A upside down, for example, and the S back to front, and gives you an idea of the letter forms on these inscribed stones. And you'll note that it's 6th century, there's from the kind of evidence we've been using, and it commemorates Devacus, son of Justus, here he lies, and it uses 2 different very common formulae. The first of these is Filius of X, son of Y, which you can see here, and the other formula is Hic Jacet, here he lies, and that in fact is a Christian formula, and I'll come to the significance of that a little later. And we suggest, or I have suggested, that where you get this combination of both the most common formulae, that this is probably in the 6th century. So we also get a series of inscribed stones in the north that are associated both with Roman roads and also with Roman forts. I only have time here to talk about one example of each. And the first one I've chosen to talk about is Penmachno 4, Penmachno number 4. Now, we didn't know until relatively recently where this was actually found, but an antiquarian record tells us that it was found in 1819 or 1820 at Rhywbach Quarry, which is above Penmachno. And this is on the line of the Roman road, stretching from Mae'r, the fort at Mae'r, to the fort at Caerhun. And it commemorates Carausius, a Roman name. Here he lies in this heap of stones. So presumably beside the Roman road, and we know that two long-kissed graves were found as well when they found the stone, that there was like a cairn, which we know of from other stones elsewhere, and that this covered the grave or graves, and that this stone marked that cairn. And we can also see that it not only do we have the Hic-Jacet formula, we also have what's known as a monogram Cairo. And this is one of only 2 examples in Wales, and it's the first 2 letters, 3 examples, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek, so for Christos. So it's a very public monument set up beside a Roman road, and it's thought that some of these monuments are in fact influenced by Roman milestones. And there are a couple of examples which are reused Roman milestones that have actually been inverted and then carved on again. Now, the one from the fort at Llanfor, this is in the heart of Meirionnydd, and the stone here is now built into the tower of the church, which is unfortunately redundant and in very poor repair. And the church is located just about here, and this is on the edge of a very rich Roman military landscape. Here's the fort down here. Here's the marching camp or practice ground up here. And presumably this stone was originally in the cemetery somewhere immediately outside the fort. But it's important to note that the fort was not occupied after the earlier 2nd century. Therefore, what we're seeing here is a continuing interest in the environs of Roman forts into the 5th and 6th centuries. And I think that this is part of the ongoing, if you like, recognition of a continuing Roman identity for some inhabitants in early medieval Wales. This one just has a name on it, and it may, as you can see, it's a fragmentary stone. There may originally have been more of it, but that's all that survives today. Now, the other main context which we can trace archaeologically is our early medieval cemeteries. And it's perhaps no surprise that we would find an early medieval inscribed stone marking a grave in one of these early medieval cemeteries that are often made up of a combination of dug inhumation graves and long-kissed graves. But these do not have finds in them generally. And because the bones don't survive very often, they're often very difficult to date with precision. Now, the site I've chosen to talk about is a very well-known one, the site of Capel Eithin in Anglesey, which was dug in the early 1980s by Gwynedd Archaeological Trust. And we can see here a succession of phases. There are 2, for example, there's a Bronze Age cremation cemetery here in phase 2, and then a Bronze Age cairn here in phase 3. And then in the Roman period, there's quite a puzzling rectangular stone structure here, which is thought possibly to represent some kind of Romano-Celtic shrine. It was originally published as a signal station, but that doesn't really make sense. And then in the early medieval period, there's a cemetery which is clearly well aware of the Bronze Age cairn and the other remains. So what and it includes this enclosed grave here with a later grave set into it and other grave here. So we don't know very much about the early inscribed stone from this site, but it was recorded, like a number of others, only by the great Welsh antiquary Edward Llwyd, who died in 1709. And here we can see a copy of his manuscript. I'm afraid his manuscript was burnt in a fire. And you can see that it records an inscribed stones with Devorigi. It is a G, this, because we know it's a G of Devorix, which you can see down here. And it tells us where it's from. It's from that site. So in the early middle, well, the 5th to around the 7th centuries, we have a lot of cemeteries which appear to reuse earlier prehistoric sites and sometimes Roman sites as well. And in this, there is a looking back and a reinvention of the prehistoric past. And we can see this very clearly on this site, and I'll talk about another one at Arfrin later on. Now, you see that I've used this term undeveloped cemeteries. Now, this was a term originally coined by Charles Thomas in the late 1960s, early 1970s, to describe perhaps kin cemeteries, community cemeteries, which may have had a mixture of Christians and non-Christians buried in them, which did not go on to become church sites. However, a number of them clearly did, because we have from Carmarthenshire the site of Eglwys Gymyn, and this site, as you can see, is perhaps a typical round churchyard, which is found across Wales. And from that, in the 19th century, this stone was found. And it was dug up in the churchyard, which is very typical for these inscribed stones. And it suggests that this site has its origins in the 5th or 6th centuries, when this stone was originally marking a grave, perhaps in an early medieval cemetery. But then it grows on to develop by the end of the early medieval period into a church site, though when it actually got the church building is another matter. And this is, as you can see, a mixture of both a Roman inscription here and an Ogam inscription, and it commemorates a woman, Avitoria, the daughter of Cynnar. And you can see here also the Irish version in the Ogam of her name and the Irish word for daughter in Igena. So we've looked now at the contexts. I'm going to go on now to look at connections. Now, there are two important series of connections that are significant for understanding the early medieval inscribed stones and indeed the society which we have in Wales in the period between around 400 and 650. And the first is something that's very familiar to many of you, I'm sure, the concept of the Atlantic seaways. This is how it's shown in Barry Cunliffe's 2001 map. And we can see here that Wales and indeed Ireland and Western Scotland are part of a broader seaways that go down through Western France, through the coast of Spain, and then on into the Mediterranean. Now, this is significant for the inscribed stones because the formula, for example, hic iac it, is a Christian formula that begins in Rome, but is found, for example, in Trier, on the Rhine, in around the beginning of the 5th century, but is also found on the Rhone here, so it may have come in from France, probably the most likely, possibly from the west coast or from the Rhone. And we also now know that there are important links, which I'll come to later, with Spain or Iberia. Now, archaeologically, we can see these links by looking at both the imported pottery from the Mediterranean and also imported pottery from southwest France. Both the pottery here and what's often called D-ware or DSP, A and E-ware, come from just round Bordeaux, which is clearly an important link with Britain in this period. But also we have this Phocian red slipware from Turkey, and we have a series of imported amphorae for wine and possibly olive oil, which come from the Greek islands and also from Turkey, that sort of area. And also from France, we have a series of different types of different colors and different vessels, different glass vessels, which were probably for drinking wine, that was also probably imported from southwest France. So these are all finds from the famous early medieval hill fort at Dinas Powys, excavated by Leslie Alcock in the late 1950s. And these may not have arrived, unlikely many of them, to have arrived directly in Wales from the Mediterranean or indeed from France, but they may have been various sort of posts on the way, notably for many of them Tintagel in Cornwall, where large amounts of Mediterranean material have been found. So that's one important set of connections. The other important set of connections are more local, if you like, and they consist of connections around and across the Irish Sea in this period, and links between peoples in Ireland, in Cornwall, in Wales, and in Scotland, who spoke different Celtic languages. And we can see that in Wales, we can see a distribution of the inscribed stones, again, that we've been talking about, but we can also see that these are characteristic of Cornwall. We can see some in Somerset and Devon. There are some in the Isle of Man, and then a few in northern Britain here, which are associated with the British. And then these are the Pictish symbol stones up here, which are contemporary broadly with the inscribed memorial stones, which we have here, and probably fulfilled a similar functions. Now in Ireland, we have the Ogam stones. And you can see here that what we have, of course, is Irish settlement in Wales and Cornwall in this period. And so we have not only shared Celtic languages, though they are Irish is Goidelic and Welsh is Brythonic, but we also have, to a certain extent, a shared material culture in this period, which is very obvious in things like brooches, for example. Now, I want to begin by saying a little bit about British or Welsh identities. And just to show you, moving on to identities, I want to show you two examples. Now, when the corpus of early medieval inscribed stones was put together, Professor Patrick Sims-Williams did a lot of research on the name forms, and I'm drawing on some of that research in order to talk about these different identities in different parts of Wales and how they change over time as we see them in the inscriptions. Now, from Gwrtherin in Denbighshire, for example, this stone stands in the churchyard of the former church there, and it has two British names, and it commemorates its ex-son of Y, of Vinemaglus, son of Senemaglus, and you can see this is a very typical one with capital letters here, and just a very broad translation of these two names of White or Holy Prince, son of Old Prince. So the names often of a son and a father often relate to each other. And from that helps to show us, I suppose, kin between different individuals. At the end of we don't have that many British names on these inscribed stones overall. There are more Irish and Roman ones. But by the 7th century, the number of British or Welsh names is steadily increasing. It's possible that in the 5th and 6th centuries, the population with a British identity didn't feel the need to erect inscribed stones, whereas those with an Irish identity and a Roman identity perhaps did so. And but Catamanus, who we've already met at Llangadwaladr on Anglesey, this is a Latin form of his Welsh name, Cadfan, it's a Welsh name, is perhaps one of the beginning of this kind of rise which we see in British identity as the period continues. Now, let's come to Irish identities. I think it's important to say that if you have an Irish name on one of these inscribed stones, it doesn't necessarily mean you come from Ireland, but that you have been named in an Irish name, with an Irish name. Now, we've seen where the Ogham stones in Ireland are found. Now, they're concentrated, as you can see, down here in County Waterford and County Cork and County Kerry, with a scattering elsewhere. And it's probably people from that area that came to Dyfed, Southwest Wales, particularly Pembrokeshire, North Pembrokeshire, in the post-Roman period, probably taking advantage of the kind of vacuum left over at the end of the Roman period, though there may also have been important reasons in Ireland why these people moved. How many moved is an enormous question, which I cannot answer. It may have been a relatively few elite people who moved, but it may have been significantly more than that. And the main concentration is in Southwest Wales here, but there is also evidence up here on Anglesey, which I'll come to in a minute, and indeed in Breconshire. And we'll look at some examples of these stones with a changing identity now. Now, there are a small number, I think 9 early inscribed stones, which are probably the earliest in this series, probably 5th century, which are have Ogam only inscriptions, right? And this is the one from Beddau, which is one of the longest of these. And it's from North Pembrokeshire. It stands in the churchyard, and it has a distinctively Irish formula of Netosagri, son of the kindred of Briarchy. Now it's this Mackie instead of Philly here, Mackie and then Muckoi, which is distinctive of Ogam inscriptions in Ireland. And it's, I suppose, we think that both the names are Irish, and that therefore this is possibly a first generation settler. We obviously don't know, from Ireland. You can see the Ogam in good light, distinctively going from bottom to top on the side, the angle of the stone. And this is very characteristic. But the cross here, I should say, is not contemporary with the rest of the carving. It's been added possibly to, well, presumably to Christianize the monument retrospectively. I would guess possibly about the 9th or 10th century. We know, incidentally, that there was an early medieval Longkist cemetery outside the site of the present cemetery, this present church site at Beddau. Now, we can see the kind of mixing of Irish and other identities on these two inscribed stones. On the left, we have here the stone from St. Dogmaels, which we've already seen. And incidentally, this was the first inscribed stone in Wales where they managed to read the Ogam and the Latin together. And because the Ogam is a translation of the Latin, which of course made it easier to read. And this was done around 1850, I think. And you can see here that it commemorates a man called Sagrani here, or Sagragni in Ogam, who was the son of, and that's the equivalent of Mackie, Philly here is the equivalent of Mackie, son of Cunatami. And what is interesting here is that the son has an Irish name, but the father has a British name. And therefore we can see, if you like, the intermingling or the mixing of these various identities in the way that people were given names in perhaps the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Now, even more extraordinary is this inscribed stone from Penbryn in Cardiganshire. And this one, as you can see, it's a very clear inscription, commemorates Corbalengus, and then it has a Hic-Iacit formula, so it's Christian, but then it commemorates him as coming from the tribe of the Ordovicians. Now, the name Corbalengus is an Irish name, but he obviously had an identity that was derived from the late Iron Age tribe, or I don't like much of the late Iron Age people of central to North Wales. And this Ordovician identity continues through the Roman period. And here in the, I don't know, 6th century, late 5th, 6th century, is a man who is with an Irish name, who is also claiming this much older native British identity. And incidentally, this stone was found on top of a cairn originally, where there were Roman artifacts found. So presumably this was a Roman period burial cairn, and it's possible that it was reused even in the Roman period, and that it was previously a prehistoric burial cairn. So the identities here and the reinvention of the past are both absolutely key to understanding both the period that we're dealing with overall and this individual early medieval inscribed stone. Now, if we move to Anglesey now, there's only one Ogam inscription from Anglesey, which I'll show you later on. But there are 3 others, at least 3 others, maybe 4 others, I think, with Irish names. And I just wanted to show you one of them. And this is the stone commemorating a Cagney, as you can see here. This one was the one that was found in 1971, and it's rare. It was found during an archaeological excavation. Unfortunately, it was not found in situ. It was found reused as a kind of footbridge over a ditch, which is quite common actually for discoveries of early medieval inscribed stones. However, the excavation is extremely interesting because in the first phase, we have a Middle Bronze Age settlement enclosure. The site is right on the top of a hill with very wide views over northern Anglesey. But in the early medieval period, 5th and 6th centuries approximately, it was reused when what was presumed to be, I suspect at that time, the remains of a building was mistaken as the remains of a cairn with a ditch round it. And this became the focus of a cemetery. And the excavator, John Hedges, who published the site, suggested that this might have been the original site of the early medieval inscribed stone, right on top of the hill. So in other words, looking out over this area of northern Anglesey. We should remember that in Ireland in this period, burial monuments were prehistoric burial monuments, which looked quite similar to this early this Bronze Age settlement, were also being reused as the sites of Ogam stones and other burials in the 5th and 6th centuries. And indeed, we know from later documents, 7th century documents, that these sites in Latin were called furta, and they sort of go back and reinvent the prehistory for an early medieval audience. So it's possible that that's what we're seeing here. All the stones with Irish names come from the northern part of the island. So it's possible that Irish settlement was going on in this northern half of the island in perhaps the 5th and 5th century. Now we come to Roman identities. Now, in this period, I just want to show you two examples. This one here from Carmarthenshire. It's important to note, it's from a place called Newchurch in Carmarthenshire, that the inscription here was recut in the 18th century following the lettering that was recorded by the antiquary Edward Lloyd. That's why it looks very sharp, and part of it is on a destroyed face. However, it gives us the name of the person, of Severinus, son of Severus. Absolutely obvious that these are Roman names, very common Roman names. This one here is one that was found around 2008 in Llandanog churchyard in Meirionnydd. And this one, you can see that the style of the lettering here is very different from many that we've been looking at up to now. It's carved with a knife, and therefore it's much sort of lighter touch than what we see generally, which is often done with a punch. And this, all the stones, I think, from Llandanog, there's 3 of them, all have Roman names. And you can see here, Gerontius, here he lies, the son of Spectatus. And you can see Spectatus, S-P-E-C, T, the A upside down, the T, the V, and it's an I at the end there. And the first part is sort of partially destroyed, but can be reconstructed. So that is just 2 examples there of Roman names. And it's obvious that people want to continue to have names are going down the generations. expressing this continuing Roman identity. Now, this stone, which is a very famous one, Castell Dwyran from Carmarthenshire, is rather more complex. Now, it's Ogam and in Latin, and the Latin, it's clearly Christian. It has a North African formula, which is shows this link that I was talking about with the Mediterranean beforehand, memoria of Vortiporigis Protectoris, the memorial or tomb of Vortipor the Protector. Now, just his name in an Irish form here in the Ogam that goes up there. Now, the significance of this is that we have a Ogam and Roman letter inscribed stone, which is Christian, and the name of the man commemorated is also Irish, but he has a Latin title, Protector, which links right back to the Roman Imperial Guard. So what is this man doing? The stone comes from beside a Roman road in Carmarthenshire. So what is this man doing with this title? Is it a title that is passed down through the generations from the late 4th century, say, from father to son? Or is this title being reinvented in the 6th century to kind of make this particular individual more important, if you like, and perhaps is linked to the kingdom of Dyfed? Now, I should say, just to avoid confusion, that it used to be thought that this stone commemorated the King Vortipor, who is one of the tyrants named in Gildas's mid-6th century De Exidio, the only significant document which we have from this period. This was how it was published in 1895 when it was found. We now know, and Patrick Sims-Williams has demonstrated this, that the form of the name, which as you can see has no R there, is not the same as Vortipor with an R, which is mid-6th century. And indeed, linguistically, this seems to be slightly earlier. Now, we have a similar example of this from the north. We have two, this is from Beddau Gwyra Dydwi in Meirionydd, and we have here the stone commemorating Cantiorix. Here he lies. He was a citizen of Gwynedd and cousin of Maglos the magistrate. And we can see here that the names of Cantiorix and Maglos are both British, but they are using Latin concepts of a citizen here, Ciwys, sorry, and of also a magistrate. Both of those are Roman offices or Roman titles, I suppose. And also the kingdom of Gwynedd, Venedos, is mentioned for the first time, Gwynedd, on this mid-6th century inscribed stone. This is from a moorland beside a Roman road, but also with prehistoric cairns once, not far from Festiniog. Now, lastly, I want to just say something about Christian identities. And we have to remember that Christianity in this period was introduced during the Roman period, and that it survives in the area that became Wales without a break during the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries and onwards. So we have continuity from the Roman period onwards. Now, it's quite difficult to find, I must be admitted, evidence of Christianity in Roman Wales, but we do have an artifact from Caerwent, the Roman town of Caerwent. And this was found in one of the upper class 4th century houses in Caerwent. This cadre, I suppose, of pottery, but also with a pewter bowl. And this pewter bowl has a Cairo graffito on the base of the bowl. So the first 2 letters of Christ's name. And this has been suggested that this is a Christian agape set, a set for feasting after the Mass. So we also have likely we certainly have early medieval, probably Christian burials from outside Caerwent, East Gate. And eventually there's a monastery that develops in the centre of the old Roman town. And what we likely have in the vicinity of Caerwent is the continuation of a Roman Christian population. Now, I'm just going to show you 3 examples of this Christian identity. The first, again from a moorland beside a Roman road, also near a large prehistoric standing stone, comes from Trawsfynydd in Mae'r, is this inscription, which you can now go and see in the National Museum in St Fagans. And it is inscribed with a slightly longer version of this Christian hic jacet formula. Hic in tumulo jacet, here in this tomb lies. Porreus, there's his name up there. And the most important bit from our point of view is it actually tells us Homo Christianus fuit, he was a Christian man. Now we know this because the X of the Cairo, Christianus here, which is abbreviated, has been removed, but it was recorded by Edward Llwyd as that in about 1699. And the reason we've got all this graffiti on it was it was used as a shoot at by the army in the early 20th century, and that's caused a lot of damage to this stone. But it's actually publicizing the fact he was a Christian man. In other words, baptized probably, that's what they're indicating. The longest Christian inscription we have from early medieval Britain is this one, and this is in Oriel Gwynedd in Storiel in Bangor. And this comes from Northern Anglesey, and it commemorates the wife, most holy woman, but the inscription is all about her husband, who is clearly a very important man. And it has a number of formulae in it. The man commemorated is Bivatisi, you can see here, but it tells us he was famulus Dei, sacerdos et vaso Paulini. He was, in other words, a servant of God. This formula is a Christian formula found in southwest France, well, the Rhone Valley and in Iberia. He was a priest, and he was also a servant of a disciple of Paulini. Again, Vaso is found in southwest France and in Iberia. Then at the end of the inscription, it gives a number of something about his character. And this is all carefully put together in the manner of a continental panegyric poem from this period, showing links again, probably with Gaul and Iberia. And then the allusion to gold and precious stones is in fact an allusion to the Old Testament. So we can see that by the 6th century, we have important links on this stone with the continent, but also the growing power of Christianity in this period. And lastly, we can also see the origins of monasticism. And we can see here the stone from Western Anglesey, from Llanfaelog, and originally, we only knew about the Roman letter inscription, which says Maelisi. But this was one of the most, I thought we had to end on one of the most exciting days of my archaeological life, when I went into, it had been reset in a farm shed, and I went in and I saw the Ogam inscription for the first time. And this says Maelisu, and the name, Patrick Sims Williams, it tells me, means the bald one of Jesus, and it means he's a priest, and he may indeed be a monk in early medieval 6th century Anglesey. And the name on the stone, Maelisi, gives its name to the parish of Llanfaelog, where the inscribed stone was found. It wasn't actually found in the churchyard, but elsewhere in the parish. So to conclude, we can see from these early medieval inscribed stones the importance in Western Britain of continuity with the Roman past, especially the continuity of Latin literacy and the rise of Christianity. We can see the period of shifting identities, Roman, Irish, and British, and the kingdom formation and the increasing power of Christianity. And the inscribed stones offer one significant key to understanding this very complex period. And through the examination of the contexts they were found and the language and wording of these inscriptions. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.